Well, good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Is this on? Can you hear me? Is this thing working? Is the amplification working? No. The amplification isn't working. It's turned on here. Okay? Better. I hope the mic for our principal speaker is stronger. We have just invested a lot of money in a system which is quite sophisticated, and one of the aspects of it is that it's much more difficult now when you're speaking here to know if the amplification is going on out there. But if it isn't, we need to know. Well, good morning and welcome to our May Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We're happy to have you here. There's a It's amazing how a few little comments from the boss will make things happen. We have a great turnout for a great speaker here, and it's a very exciting occasion for us. There's a nice full crowd here, and a lot of regulars and a lot of occasional folks and some new faces to this event. We do live in interesting times. I spent all of my life, as soon as I became politically awake, knowing that every year there was going to be a rash of left-wing propaganda and activity on May Day. And you can remember, most of you at least can remember, when the news was filled on May Day and the day after with the analysis of the new equipment trundling through Red Square, the analysis of the ranking of the hierarchy of the Soviet High Command, huge demonstrations everywhere across the world. You opened the paper this morning and the headline is, as my wife pointed out to me, deliciously ironic, that President Bush has repudiated the ABM treaty. The extreme left is still there, of course, and there were demonstrations, particularly in Europe, and a few hundred people here, a few thousand people there, a few bricks and bottles thrown. One Scandinavian government official had a cream pie thrown in his face, and it doesn't seem quite as serious and threatening a May Day celebration as we've experienced through many years. So far, the Leadership Institute has trained in this year 1,189 students in 50 schools. We have placed 47 job seekers through our free employment placement service. The campus leadership program, where we have been for some years going out organizing, identifying, recruiting, activating, organizing independent conservative campus groups. We are now up to 214 active campus groups in 37 states. You have before you on your tables our 2001 school schedule. That's the current schedule. There will be other schools scheduled during the course of the year. Of course, please take a moment to review the calendar and consider either attending one of our programs or encouraging folks to attend our programs. Our aim is to increase the number and the effectiveness of conservative activists, and we are running ahead still, and again, running ahead of our pace of training and activity of last year. I would like now to introduce to you Neil Martin, who will offer an invocation and a pledge of allegiance. Neil graduated from a homeschool program at the age of 14 and has since then worked as an administrative assistant and counselor at a crisis pregnancy center in Southwest Virginia. During the past 5 years, she's also started a professional dancing and acting career. In 2001, she was a stalwart volunteer for the Forbes presidential campaign, and she's currently interning here at the Leadership Institute in our Center for Print and Broadcast Media. Tennille.
Please join me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we can meet with other people of similar convictions and learn how we can glorify you by serving our country. We thank you for our speaker, Steve Forbes. We ask that you give him wisdom and clarity and open our minds and hearts to what he has to speak to us about today. I pray for our leaders of our country. I pray as they make decisions that they will recognize your sovereignty as Lord. We thank you for another day that you have blessed us with, Father. We thank you for every day that you give us to serve you. In your precious name we pray. Amen. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Tennille. And now for a word from our sponsors. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Mike Krempaski, who will give us an update on this year's 4th of July soiree. Mike is the Graduate Development Director here at the Institute, and he directs our efforts to reach out and develop relationships with graduates from our 23 different programs, which consist of 28 different schools. Previously, Mike worked as a regional coordinator in the Campus Leadership Program, where he developed the independent conservative student organizations in our Area 7. He's a native Pennsylvanian. Mike admits to being a convert to conservatism. He was the son of fairly radical leftist parents, and he came to the truth just before leaving home to attend the University of Richmond to study political science. Mike also serves on the alumni board of the Fund for American Studies. Mike Krempaski.
Good morning. All sorts of surprises. Well, before I talk about the soiree a little bit, I'm actually going to give a more broad update about our graduate development efforts here at the Leadership Institute. And Sherry had something for me. Now, we hear often in our programs updates about how many students the Leadership Institute has actually trained. Morton mentioned a number today about how many we've trained this year. In fact, the Leadership Institute has trained to date 29,404 students. Now, if we can get do we have names scrolling? All right. The perspective I wanted to offer you is what exactly 10% of that looks like. Now, throughout my presentation, you're going to see 2,900 names scroll up the television in front of you. We wanted to show you all 29,000, but obviously, we all have to be somewhere by noon. It would, in fact, take an hour to do so at this rate. Morton has often said that early on in the history of the Leadership Institute, he could hold a staff meeting in his office. And obviously, that's no longer the case. Well, at that same time, we were also able to keep up with all our graduates with a Rolodex. Fortunately, that's not the case. Or fortunately, that's not the case. To give a little illustration of how many people 29,404 really is, I was doing a little research yesterday trying to find some numbers that made a little more sense. Like, for instance, it's 4 times the population of my hometown in Pennsylvania. It's 10 times the undergraduate enrollment in my university, which, by the way, I might point out, has a $1 billion endowment, so it's pretty obvious who's getting a better bang for their buck. But for local perspective, it's enough people to fill the MCI Center 1.5 times. Now, People have referred to this as an army of young conservatives, teams of foot soldiers to take back our country, and these are all true. But the scale and the scope of how many people that we've trained has really given rise to a really pressing need for graduate development here at the Leadership Institute. Certainly now more than ever with a friendly administration that's actually open to conservatives, and in some cases with open arms. In terms of talking about our graduates, we've heard quite a bit and very often, and we're very proud of some of our more famous graduates, like Governor Gilmore here in Virginia, or Governor Branstad, or Senator McConnell. And one thing that we found out is that the more effort that we put into getting to know our graduates, the more we find are doing really significant things. I'd just like to mention a couple. Some that you may not see on our walls here, but are certainly impacting the movement at many different levels and in many different ways. For instance, Josh London, who used to actually be a staff member here, who was not only trained by the Leadership Institute, but went on to train other students in journalism, is now the new senior editor at the American Spectator. Glenn Caroline, a Massachusetts native that we founded a YLS in Boston, of all places, in 1989, is now the director of all the grassroots for the National Rifle Association. Sheila Maloney, who we trained to help write a newspaper at Notre Dame, is now the policy director for the most conservative House caucus on the Hill, the Republican Study Committee. One of our grads who's recently reached a bit of a pinnacle as far as conservative activity is a gentleman by the name of Alex Acosta. And Alex was a Harvard student when we found him. Most people would obviously argue that there are no conservatives at Harvard, so why waste your money and your time going there, but we did. And we met Alex as an undergrad and trained him to help publish a student newspaper, and he became the editor of the Harvard Salient, the conservative paper at Harvard which still exists. Alex graduated from Harvard and went back to Harvard for law school, still a conservative. He graduated from law school, still a conservative. Significant enough for this story if we wanted to stop there. But Alex went on to be a fairly successful lawyer here in Washington, got involved with some nonprofits helping to vet and to keep an eye on judicial nominations. And on January 21st, Alex Acosta became the acting Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, which means that a graduate of the Leadership Institute is essentially in charge of all the federal law enforcement on civil rights. Essentially, for those of you that are familiar with the department, this is Bill Land Lee's deputy, had Bill Land Lee been allowed to remain in his illegal position. So the more effort we put into finding our grads, the more exciting we find out what they're doing. And it's the best way that we have to really specifically point at what kind of impact the Leadership Institute is having. Now, the mission of our graduate development department is to reach out and develop relationships with our graduates, whether we trained them 2 weeks ago or 10 years ago. Now, to that end, our goal is to offer more training. Our goal is to offer more services. Our goal is to even develop new training, because we know that people's needs changed as they progress through their career. In some cases, if we met someone on a college campus and helped them to organize youth, maybe now they're running congressional campaigns. Maybe they used to run campaigns and now they're raising money for campaigns. Maybe they ran for office and they want some more TV training. All of these different things that we want to be able to offer more and significant in-depth training to our graduates. Now, within our department, we have several activities and several ways that we meet this mission. One of the primary ways is we publish the leadership memo, which I hope many of you received, which is our bi-monthly update to our graduates from the Leadership Institute, covering issues of political technology, as well as a snapshot of what's going on in the movement in general and other resources and opportunities for our graduates to take advantage of. We act as a centralized alumni information system. Anyone that's been through a program here at the Leadership Institute can call anytime and get someone specifically in graduate development whose job it is to cater to their needs. To answer any questions, to get them the information and the materials they need, anything they need. One of the new programs that we've started has been our idea of doing regional graduate receptions. We know that there are cities in the country that we have focused more effort and more time in training conservatives. We're going through and picking those cities and going back to them and holding a fairly informal reception where we invite all the people we've trained in that city to come out for an evening to not just meet us, but to meet each other. One thing we found is that in a city like Pittsburgh, for instance, where we were last week, is we've trained probably a couple hundred people in Pittsburgh. And so there you have this group of conservatives, which some may know each other and some may not, But in reality, the only thing that really connects them is the fact that they were trained by the Leadership Institute. So if we can go to Pittsburgh, if we can set up an opportunity for these folks to meet each other and get to know each other, as well as inviting a speaker. We had our lead broadcast journalism faculty member, Scott Baker, come and talk about what it actually means to be a movement conservative. Now, obviously, we focus more on training and training activists to be effective, but we're really starting to focus on this theme of what it means to be movement-oriented, not just conservative by yourself. Graduate Development has actually taken on our 4th of July soiree this year, as well as the Conservative Leadership Conference, two things that we're both very excited about. And I'm also happy to report that you'll actually hear more about both the soiree and the CLC at later breakfasts. But I can say that as of this week, thanks to the hard work of Victoria Morgan, we actually have already exceeded the level of support from other conservative organizations for this year's 4th of July soiree, and we have 2 months to go. So we're very excited about the 4th of July soiree. It's one of my favorite events that we do. And the CLC, I can actually tell you that the Heritage Foundation is signed on as a major partner this year. So we're very excited about Heritage getting involved and everything they bring to the table. So we're looking forward to events being better and bigger than they ever have before. And finally, one of the things that we hope to do that we haven't been able to do quite yet is, instead of that Rolodex that we can't keep track of all of our donors, actually developing a survey to reach out and communicate with all of our donors in a comprehensive way to find out exactly where every graduate is, what job every graduate has, what impact they're having in their local community or in their state's political system. So hopefully, I hope to be able to come back to you next year and tell you about the other 29,000 graduates of the Leadership Institute. So the future looks really bright for what we're doing in terms of reaching out to those that we've trained. We have had a lot of success, but there is a tremendous amount of work to do. And I'd just like to thank all of you for all your support in making all of this possible.
Thank you, Mike. You speak with enthusiasm, as converts often do. It's now my pleasure to introduce our principal speaker, for whom you've come this morning on this beautiful day when you could be out strolling in lovely Northern Virginia. This is a very nice time. People who join the new administration will see this period and say, gee, it's just wonderful here in the D.C. area. But in a couple of months, when the heat and humidity becomes reality, we'll get to them, although there's nothing like the heat and humidity of Baton Rouge, where Helen and I grew up. But you've sacrificed your morning for a better cause, and that is to come here, Steve Forbes. He is president and CEO of Forbes Incorporated and editor-in-chief of Forbes magazine, the nation's foremost business magazine. He writes a regular column, fact and comment, in every issue, and has won 4 times the prestigious Crystal Owl Award for economic forecasts for the coming year, which proved to be most accurate. He mounted a vigorous presidential campaign in '96 and then in 2000, and most of you know that I was a strong supporter of his race in 2000. I believed he is one of the few people I have ever known whom I would be happy to have President of the United States. Although he withdrew in February of 2000, his campaign had a major impact and has been widely credited with considerable influence on the national debate. The Wall Street Journal said, quote, "Without Mr. Forbes' ideas, indeed neither John McCain nor George W. Bush would have much of an agenda of his own this year." Key to the Forbes platform were a flat tax that's a tax cut, a retirement security system, power to parents plan, and medical savings accounts. And these matters, many of them are currently at the top of the public policy agenda of the administration and the congressional leadership, and others of them will in due course hit the top of that agenda. Mr. Forbes is author of an excellent book, if you haven't read it, A New Birth of Freedom. It's a bold book of bold ideas for the millennium. When Ted Myers and I were visiting Mr. Forbes a little earlier this year, he presented a copy of it to Ted and said, "This is a copy of my unfortunately not best-selling book. It's a wonderful book and filled with good ideas." Between the 96 and the 2000 election periods, Steve was the honorary chairman of Americans for Hope, Growth, and Opportunity, which was a grassroots issue advocacy organization, and they pushed pro-growth, pro-freedom, and pro-family issues. He was chairman of the board of directors of Empower America, a reform organization organized by Jack Kemp and Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick. He received a BA in history from Princeton, another example of how you can get an Ivy League education and not go left. He founded there at Princeton a magazine, Business Today, which became the country's largest magazine published by students for students. He had a circulation of 200,000. Talk about an effective student publication. We need you to come give lectures at our student publication school and how to do that. He just an extraordinary man. Anybody who is sensible knows he's one of the wisest and most committed and pleasant and decent people in the political spectrum of our country. He now serves on the Board of Trustees of Princeton, where he no doubt is fighting considerable odds, as the newspapers have pointed out from time to time. He's also on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Board, the American Enterprise Institute Board, and the National Taxpayers Union. He's on the Board of Overseers of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Folks, this is one of the great men of America, and we are very honored and pleased to present him to you at this Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. Steve Forbes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Morton, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you for putting the best face possible, spin as they call it in this town, on my two unsuccessful attempts to have a midlife career change. But Tennille, thank you for your help. And thank all of you, as Mike and Morton did, for coming here today. I hope what I say won't give you indigestion, but I think it's very wise that in a meeting like this that you eat before the speakers speak, so there's no food on the table that can land in places where it shouldn't land. But before I make my remarks this morning, I've been asked to make some remarks on the economy, and I would just like to anticipate one question right now, and that is the stock market. People always ask, what is going to happen to the stock market? And I always respond, first of all, by saying you haven't yet, you ought to subscribe to Forbes magazine. You've got a very good price. This way, my trip here is now deductible. You see, I was discussing business with you. And then I like to quote a favorite saying of my grandfather, who founded Forbes magazine. He was an immigrant from Scotland at the turn of the last century, one of 10 children, grade school education, very little money. But like millions who came to this country, he had dreams and ambitions. And he started Forbes in the year 1917, which was the same year as the Russian Revolution. And wherever my grandfather is today, he must be delighted that his creation outlasted Lenin's creation. But when asked about the markets, he would invariably reply that you make more money selling the advice than following it. So some of you can appreciate that more than others, but that's in the interest of full disclosure. Well, concerning what is happening to our economy right now, I think that we all know the U.S. economy has been in a bit of a slowdown since last fall. We know certainly what's happened to various parts of the stock market. And I think that we can all be grateful that we have a new regime here in Washington, because at least some things are being done that I think can pull us out of this temporary slowdown rather than deepening it, which I think would have happened if the other candidate was in the White House today. I think that it's important to understand why the American economy went into a slowdown. We sort of have right now, certainly outside of high tech, the equivalent of flu. It's not enough to put you out of commission, but you don't feel very good about it. And now we see with the first quarter numbers that perhaps there might be some sluggish growth, that we won't go into a formal recession, but certainly if you're in business, it has been pretty much of a dicey time in most parts of the country. I think there's several reasons why the economy went into this phase. It had nothing to do fundamentally with what happened with high tech. After all, in the 1980s, the energy industry, which at the beginning of the decade employed more people than the auto industry, went into a severe slump in the 1980s. Texas was an economic wasteland in the mid-1980s. Agriculture went through a terrible time, especially in the Midwest. Yet the American economy as a whole did fairly well through that period. So you can have parts of the economy go through a wrenching downturn, a wrenching change, and still have the economy as a whole performing fairly well. And in terms of high tech, even though a lot of the dot-coms have gone down and more will go down, the technology is very, very real. As the cliche goes, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now just remember, in the early 1980s, when the PC, the personal computer, burst upon the scene, a lot of the original makers went out. Remember the Franklin computer? Remember Atari? Remember Commodore? Texas Instruments tried it. They all went out of business in that field. But the technology was real and PCs went ahead, fundamentally changed the way offices worked. In the late 1980s, you may remember, the press was full of stories about how we weren't going to be able to make chips in this country anymore. Japanese were going to dominate high-tech and microchips. Well, how the world has changed with that. And 100 years ago, we had 300 automobile manufacturers in this country. Only about 2.5 are left in America today. But you look out the window, and cars are still being made and driven. So you get enormous turnover and change, but the technology is very, very real. There are a couple of basic reasons why, a couple of short-term reasons why the economy took a hit, and some longer-term reasons. And let me just touch on those. One reason why we had the slowdown, the most immediate one, was our friends at the Federal Reserve Board, our central bank. They have this strange notion, and it's shared by central bankers around the world and shared by a lot of economists who know better. They have this notion that prosperity causes inflation. It doesn't. After all, in the 1980s, we had a long run of prosperity thanks to Ronald Reagan, and inflation went down by 2/3. In the last decade, we had a long run of prosperity. Growth rates not quite as high as they were under Reagan, but there were growth rates. And the only inflation we had was what OPEC engineered and what crazy regulators did in California. If anyone's from California, there is a basket out there to put money in to buy you candles. You know, we are compassionate. But there is no real inflation out there. However, when people like you are happy, when you are smiling, central bankers get worried. There is something wrong. You know, they've taken the Puritan ethic to an extreme. You know, you never see Alan Greenspan wearing shorts. You You'd never see Alan Greenspan do a gig on Regis or Oprah. They're very dour people. I don't know what it is, but so they get upset when there's a lot of prosperity around. They figure they have to do something about it. And one of the things I would have done if I'd been elected was to mandate a dress-down Friday for the Federal Reserve. Loosen up, guys. My life's not so bad. So the Fed decided that they had to do something about all this happiness and giddiness out there. And so they deliberately raised rates. They deliberately engineered a slowdown. And I think they suddenly discovered earlier this year that they may have overdone it. And another thing that upset them, in addition to this prosperity, was the stock market. Now, I don't know why the federal government's got to get in the business of trying to manipulate stocks. As you know, markets can send stocks up and they can knock them down. The market will take care of itself. But Alan Greenspan got worried about the market. Remember 4.5 years ago he gave that speech where he talked about irrational exuberance. And he got out of the stock market. The Dow then was 6,400. Even at the low point, it was still about 40-50% higher than when he bailed out of the market. So he was upset a long time ago about the stock market. And then at the same time he got married. First time in 50 years he got married. God bless him. And he married Andrea Mitchell, as you know, of NBC. And you can just imagine the year-end conversations. Alan got out of the market, went into savings bonds. You can imagine the year-end conversations. She would say to him, Alan, you great maestro, you muscular financial guru. How did your portfolio do this year? Mine was up 50%. Oh, yours was up 4%? Oh, and you're the genius. Oh, okay. So this guy had it in, he had it in for Wall Street. But anyway, the Fed overdid it. Earlier this year, they've started the process of unwinding their mistake. And my feeling is, why dribble the thing out? You made a mistake, do your reflation, do your cutting, get it done right now. Don't dribble it out. But Federal Reserve's got to do something each day, and so they do it in incremental steps. Bring down interest rates. They still haven't done it enough. They still haven't pumped enough liquidity into the economy. We're like an athlete. We're suffering a little bit of dehydration. We need more liquidity. But the Fed is going to prolong this. Now, another reason why the market, another reason why the economy is beginning to be a little sluggish is because of what they're debating now on Capitol Hill, and that is taxes. As you well know, and too many on Capitol Hill do not, especially in the other party, is that taxes are not just a means of raising revenue. Taxes are also a price and a burden. I feel like a dummy having to say it, but you have to keep reminding these people. Remedial education doesn't work for them. That the tax you pay on income, the tax you pay on profits and capital gains is the price you pay for working. The price you pay for being successful, for being willing to take risks. And the proposition is very simple. When you lower the price and burden on those good things, you get more of them. When you raise them, you get less of them. Very, very basic, very, very simple. True here, true around the world. Now today, as you know, the federal government is taking a higher percent of your income than at any time, perhaps in American history, and certainly since World War II. And this is one of the paradoxes of this crazy code we have, tax code, and that is when you are prosperous, you get kicked up into higher tax brackets. You are punished for being successful. And not only do you get kicked into higher tax brackets, but some of the deductions and tax credits that you had suddenly get clawed away because you hit tripwires and they suddenly take them away. And now hundreds of thousands of middle-class Americans are discovering they're getting hit by the alternative minimum tax, which was designed 30 years ago to hit millionaires. That was a lot of money then. It was designed to get people who weren't paying taxes, and now it's going to hit middle-class Americans. If you have several children, the alternative minimum tax says you're taking too many deductions and whacks you for it. There was a case last year. A family had a lot of loved kids, had 10 kids. Income, $68,000, they got penalized in the tax code. Too many deductions. Crazy thing. So we need real tax cuts, real tax relief, real tax reform. And I have to laugh, sort of, when the Democrats, the liberals, say that $1.6 trillion, they've now agreed yesterday to do $1.35, like this, it sounds like a lot of money. In Washington, even $1 trillion still counts for something. However, that's a meaningless number. It's over 10 years. The American economy is going to produce over $100 trillion. So this is a penny on the dollar. Penny on the dollar of the American economy. What's the big deal? It's smaller than what Kennedy proposed 40 years ago, smaller than what Ronald Reagan proposed in the past 20 years ago. It's not a big deal. And the number itself is meaningless. I mean, you tell me what's going to happen 10 years from now. I've got a job for you if you can. It's a meaningless number. It assumes no good will come from the tax cut. It's just bogus. But on Capitol Hill, they conjure these things up. And so we're stuck with it. And now that they've had this agreement, the key is what they're going to put in that $1.35 trillion. I hope, and this is where the Democrats are onto something, I hope that instead of, again, dribbling the tax cut out 5 years, make it all retroactive. Do the whole thing at once. If you need medicine, don't dribble it out over 5 years. Take it now. We need it now. So I hope they make it as muscular as possible, and they ought to add to it. I mentioned the alternative minimum tax. Get rid of it. Another thing they should do is reduce the capital gains tax. That's a winner all around. It means more government revenue right away. Every time we reduce those rates, you get instant government revenue. After all, even with the unpleasantness in NASDAQ, we have over $10 trillion of unrealized capital gains. You get a little bit of that, people moving from one asset to another, government makes out. It also means more risk-taking, means better standard of living in the future. Winner all around. They shouldn't have the tax, but we have it, so reduce the rate. Reduce it from 20 to 10. That's what you should put on the table. Then maybe you get 15. But don't settle for 18. Don't settle for 10-year holding periods. Don't make it put a time bomb on it that after 3 years you're going to lose it. I mean, make it clean. Do it right. Another thing they should do is extend the moratorium. I know this is controversial, but extend the moratorium on internet taxes. They're going to let that expire in October, and everyone's going to start slapping on extra taxes on the internet, and you know what's going to happen. It's going to be the vehicle eventually with which we're going to get a VAT in this country. Now, a lot of people support a national sales tax, but they do that as an alternative to the income tax, not what they do in Europe as an addition to the income tax. So watch out on that moratorium. It's not just about the internet. They're going to use that as a vehicle to put mechanisms in place that will eventually lead to a VAT, value-added tax, in this country, in addition to an income tax, the worst of both worlds. So there's a lot that has to be done on the tax side. And the more we do, the faster we do it, the better. And if we can get it done now, push it now. Now, some say, well, maybe we should wait till next year. Well, that's fine if you think you're going to have an environment next year in which you can push these things. But if you see an opportunity, like in business, you don't wait. You take what you can get now, as much as you can get now, because you never know what the future is going to bring. Now, let me quickly mention a couple of other things that are holding things up in this country. Vice President Cheney, a couple of days ago, talked about energy. California, New York, and others were discovering that in order to have energy, somebody's got to make energy. It's like going to the supermarket and buying a bottle of milk. It's got to come from a cow. I mean, it just doesn't show up magically. The same is true of energy. And there are a lot of things that can be done. He outlined some very sensible approaches on increasing energy supply in this country. And one thing that was not mentioned, but I think we should push in terms of a global solution, is mineral rights. Think of it for a moment. In this country, if you find oil on your land, you can get a royalty for it. You own the rights to it. In most countries, you don't own the rights to minerals beneath your land. So if you discover oil in Mexico, guess what? Pemex takes it. You don't get a royalty from it. unless you know certain politicians. And the same true in Russia, same in China. Mexico's got a geology like much of our oil patch. Now, if you could just have mineral rights from Mexican nationals, I guarantee you, if people thought that if they punched a hole in their land they could get money for it, you'd see the kind of exploration in other countries that you get in this country. And you'd have oil coming out of our ears. And Al Gore would be apoplectic. You'd have 20-cent gasoline. It would just be all taxes. And so there are a lot of sensible things to be done on the energy side here and overseas. Another thing that's hurting, I mentioned high tech, is that high tech has collided with regulation. Now, until a couple of years ago in high tech, you could do anything you wanted. There was no national commission, no commission on software like you do in communications or trade. You can do anything you want. But now high tech has collided with telephones, television, radio, cable, and we have regulatory structures that are now obsolete. On telephony, there is no difference now between a local call and a long-distance call on the internet. That's a regulatory artifact. And what they ought to do is clear all that stuff away so that we can let we the people, determine how we're going to do these things, and let the technology move forward, get the pipelines into our homes, and get wireless really going as it's ready to do. And I guarantee you, in the next 7 or 8 years, you're going to see in high tech, even though it's a lot of debris today, in the next 7 or 8 years there's going to be $1 trillion invested in capital spending, in wireless, in fiber. It's just ready to happen. And just to give you one example, they're now about to make chips. IBM made a breakthrough on it based on molecules, which means that literally a supercomputer today will fit within a generation on the size of a speck of dust. Now imagine getting up from this breakfast, you brush yourself off, you might hit 30 supercomputers and not even know it. You're just going to be all over the place. So, and then I mentioned telephony. You see on TV, you see these ads, 8 cents a minute, or our plan is 5 cents a minute, or if you call Sunday morning at 4 a.m. and no one answers, 2 cents a minute. All of these great programs they have for you. It's going to be just but a few years before that's going to be a fraction of a penny per minute. It's going to be almost a giveaway, voice telephony. So great things are coming. But we do have some regulatory structures that have to be changed that were designed for an economy that really isn't with us today. Another area that you're well familiar with is tort reform. The rule of law is gradually being undermined in this country. You see it on the tobacco settlement, which is taxation through litigation. Now, no one should smoke. We know smoking's not good for you and all that. That's a public health matter. But under the guise of public health, you know what happened. They used that as a means of enacting a huge tax increase. They could not get it through Congress. So we have in this country today what used to happen in empires and kingdoms. In days of old, when the emperor wanted to collect taxes, they used to put out tax collecting up for bid, like you do a defense contract today. Put it up for bid. And the tax farmer, syndicates would come along, they call them tax farmers, would bid on for the contract. And that meant that if you won the bid, you'd go out in the provinces, shaft the peasants, and keep some of the money and pass some of the money on to the king or the emperor. We have tax farming in America today. And the tax farmers are the plaintiff bar. They collect money from the tobacco industry. 1/3 of it goes to the tax farmers, 2/3 of it goes to the states. And the last thing that political culture would want is for every American to stop smoking. That would be a disaster. Suddenly their money would disappear. It's cynical, it's wrong, I think it's unconstitutional, but this is a symptom of what's happening in this country. The rule of law is being undermined. And finally, let me mention one thing before we get to the Q&A, and that is international. We are in a global economy. What happens in other countries affects us. And one of the things that's happened is that, unfortunately, with cooperation of our own Treasury Department, the International Monetary Fund has become the economic equivalent of bubonic plague. Everywhere that agency goes, you get debris, you get riots, you get collapse and bloodshed. I mean, they practice economics the way docs used to practice medicine 200 years ago. And you got sick 200 years ago, doctors used to bleed you. That, of course, got rid of your pain and suffering because it got rid of you. It was a very, very, very simple matter. Very simple matter. And yet the IMF goes around and tells these countries to devalue their money. And that may work in a classroom, may work on this screen. But what happens in the real world when you have a devaluation? It means higher inflation, capital gets wiped out, the cost of capital goes up, capital flees the country. And yet it happens again and again and again. And then to compound the felony, the IMF usually tells countries to raise taxes. They did it in Argentina, which is now on the ropes. Turkey's collapsed. Now these countries all have their own problems. But it should tell you something that when the doctor goes there, the patient always ends up being in worse condition. It should tell you something that something's not right. And you combine this with the Fed being tight. One of the things the Fed doesn't realize is that the dollar's now an international currency. Like it or not, everyone around, not everyone, but hundreds of millions of people around the world use dollars rather than their own currencies. Do you realize that 2/3 of the dollars that we print in this country end up offshore? Being used offshore. That's amazing. 2/3 of the dollars we print end up being used as transaction money around the world. Even these crazy new dollars that we're printing that look like play money. That's another thing I would have done, is to mandate that we have money that looks real again, instead of this junk they have now. I mean, God almighty. So in effect, we're giving the world a 1-2 punch. With the IMF and a too tight Fed, it's no wonder we're okay. We're in a slowdown, but we're looks like we might come out of it. Even though I think we're going to have some more turmoil in the stock market, but the rest of the world is reeling. Indonesia, 4th largest country in the world, collapsing, disintegrating. Thailand, South Korea, barely recovering from the disaster of '97, which the IMF helped induce. In Mexico. The average Mexican today, even though Mexico has got a great export industry, the average Mexican today is just beginning to get back to where he or she was in 1995 before their peso collapsed thanks to the IMF and our Treasury Department. So Russia. Now Russia's created its own disasters, but we contributed to it by just throwing money at them, which all went to the oligarchs' bank accounts, never went to the people. We told them to get better on collecting taxes. Russia's tax code makes ours look simple and pristine. And as a result today, Putin, the president of Russia, is putting in an authoritarian regime. Democracy's been discredited. Free markets have been discredited. He put in a flat tax. Tells you something that Russia does it before we do. But in Russia today now has concluded a strategic arms agreement with Iran. They're doing arms deals with Libya, Syria. They're starting to stir up the waters. They can't challenge us the way they could in the Cold War. They're starting to stir the pot again. I just talked to a couple of young Russians the other day. In the media business, where Putin is cracking down on popular media. He doesn't care what small publications do. They care about TV and radio. And I made a crack about Putin being an authoritarian. The two Russians said, oh, no, he's restoring self-respect to this country. That tells you something about what we did or didn't do in the last decade. When an authoritarian regime is striking a chord in that country, and that democracy and free markets have been discredited because they never really had them. So there's a lot that we have to do on the economic side. And I haven't even mentioned the work that has to be done on life, where this administration made a good start in terms of at least not using our money to finance these things around the world. There's a lot that has to be done. We're off to a good start. But I think you all know and appreciate better than most, this is just the beginning. And there's a lot of hard work ahead of us on a whole range of critical issues. And it's not just our well-being that's at stake. The blunt truth is, if we don't get it right, the rest of the world is not going to get it right. We are the only act left. So the work that you're doing here, the Leadership Institute, getting young people to get the skills, to get the message out is essential. And every time you pick up the paper, you can see it. I'm an optimist. I think one of the great things about this democracy is our capacity to put things right when they go wrong. We do have that capacity for renewal. And this is a prime example of it, people taking time, for a shared purpose to make sure our country lives up to its ideals so that we don't let future generations down when we have these glittering opportunities. Thank you very much.
Mr. Forbes has indicated he'd take some questions, and I see a lot of hands up.
Why don't we start here, and then we'll work around.
Ted Hayes, freelance journalist. You offered a couple of suggestions for what you think our economy towards the former Soviet Union is going. What you said was very right on and very serious. But what can you offer us an idea of what you would take if you had policy ranges?
The question is, what should be done now about Russia? I think there are several things that can be done, putting aside what should have been done. First of all, we should not be pumping in money to the government anymore. We're not right now because Russia has a lot of oil revenues, thanks to what OPEC did. So we don't have much leverage there, but we certainly shouldn't be offering money if oil revenues go down. And I think we must make clear to them that we are not going to stand idly by while they try to roil the Middle East, that there will be consequences in terms of diplomacy, in terms of Russia having more relations with Europe. We have to let them know we are not very pleased with what they're doing with Iran. And we have to let the Iranians know that if they try anything beyond their shores, we are going to respond. The other day, President Bush got in trouble. They tried to show it how the guy isn't up to speed. Remember on the TV show, morning show, he said the U.S. would defend Taiwan if China attacked it. In diplomat land, that is a big no-no. You're supposed to hint at it. You're supposed to show a little leg, but you weren't supposed to be so blunt and open about it. I thought it was probably a healthy thing to say, you know, Taiwan's not going to declare independence, but violence is not going to be used, and if you use it, we're going to respond in kind. I think it just clears the air. We've got to let the Iranians and the Russians know the same thing. Inside Russia, there are elements that think that this is very crazy and dangerous to be playing with Iran like that, because a lot of those weapons that they're now going to sell them, offensive weapons, can end up in fundamentalist hands in Central Asia, which is going to hurt Russia. So we got to be more active there. We got to make sure we do our radio liberty broadcast to Russia now that the media is being cracked down on. And then longer term, Ted, I think there's one thing we should do more of. After World War II, we made a concerted effort in this country to bring young Germans over here from all walks, in academia, in business, in government, architecture, the arts, a whole range of professions. Up-and-coming young Germans to come here. You cannot explain the United States verbally. You can't do it by reading about it. You have to come here, see in all of our glory and all of our faults, understand how this republic works. And it can't be done by spending 2 days in New York in a glass tower. You got to spend a few weeks here to begin at a time, to begin to get a flavor of what this country's about. We did that with thousands and thousands of young Germans. And so he helped develop the knowledge of how you create a liberal society, traditional liberal society. And I think we got to do more of that with younger Russians so that they have a flavor of how a republic really works, and they just don't get it through distorted media. And I think longer term, again, you got to look to the future. It's the younger generations that hopefully will have a new attitude and recognize that what happened in the last 10 years was not democracy. What happened in the last 10 years was not free markets. It was truly Marxist exploitation by blood-sucking oligarchs. And unfortunately, in a fit of blindness, we subsidize those bloodsuckers. But you've got to work with the younger generation. Yes?
Mr. Forbes, how refreshing your presentation is.
Thank you.
Two-part question. Do you have a good communications link with the present administration? And the second question is, if you were in office there, how would you handle the missile defense issue?
The question is, do I have links with the new administration, and the second part was what should we be doing on missile defense. To answer the first part, about 4 months ago I had a photo op with a bunch of other business people with George Bush, but more than the occasional 6-month photo op, I think it's much more important as to who they're seeing, people like Cheney are seeing, that isn't part of the daily headlines. And I just learned the other day that some economists that I respect have had meetings with Larry Lindsay, had some long meetings with Cheney and with O'Neill, and so I'm encouraged that even if they don't think they're going to listen to these people, that they feel that they have to bring them in and keep in touch with them. I find that very helpful, because that's where you're going to get the candid feedback, not just a glorious meeting where we say all nice things and try to be polite and tell our family, gee, we got to see the president. It's talking to the people who make things happen inside that makes the difference. And in terms of missile defense, I think that we're moving in the right direction. Obviously, like you, I probably would have liked to have done it sooner, but they are laying the groundwork, serious groundwork, and I think Cheney and Rumsfeld are very serious about this, of moving ahead on missile defense. And the technology is within our grasp to have effective missile defense. You can start with the Aegis system that we now have with the Navy, upgrading that. But in terms of the ABM treaty, the administration's trying to be diplomatically nice, in effect saying it is going into the dustbin of history, which it should. But one of the reasons why we spent all these billions of dollars and we don't have a missile defense system in place is because it's had to go through this pretzel-like distortion of trying to comply with this treaty. And so once we finally get that roadblock out of the way, I think we will make some real progress in the next 5 to 10 years in developing that technology, recognizing that when you get a good defense, people are going to find a way of offense. But that's the nature of it. You got to keep on the cutting edge. It's never, you can never relax on the oars. And so I'm encouraged that they are making a serious effort, not just verbally like Clinton did, on a genuine missile defense system long term, a comprehensive one. We can do it technologically, I'm convinced. Yeah.
How do you respond to people who suggest that before running for president, you should just elect you to governor of New Jersey? Because the American people tend to be reluctant to elect someone to presidency in the first position.
The question is, why did I run for the presidency and not run for other offices first? The simple answer is I'd never intended to get into elective politics. And when in early '95, a candidate that I was thought should run chose not to, I did not see an exciting pro-growth, vibrantly conservative candidate out there that had that kind of positive message. And I guess I picked it up from my grandfather. He came from Scotland, as I mentioned. He wrote about the makers and shakers of his day and decided that he wanted to do it too. So he started his own company. And instead of just writing about what I thought were the lack of some of the platforms of candidates, all right, go out there and do it yourself. Take the plunge. So it was unorthodox, but I think it was very much in the American tradition. Don't be bound by conventions of closed shops, but bust it open. Reed Larson would understand that. And so I tried to do it politically. And it didn't work, but as Morton mentioned, I do think we got some issues on the table. So you might say the message did better than the messenger. And as for future offices, I don't have any plans to run. You never say never. But I certainly do intend to be a happy outside agitator, trying to light as many bombs as I can. Yes, in the back there.
How about the Schindler race?
The Schindler race in New Jersey. Yes. I'm supporting Brett Schindler. I'm actually chairman of his campaign. And as some of you may know, only in America, only in New Jersey could this happen. Here's a guy who is conservative. He's pro-life. He's pro-Second Amendment. He's anti-tax. He believes in medical savings accounts. And he got elected mayor of a city that is 70% minority and 90% Democrat. He's done it not once but 3 times. Now, normal people would think, boy, that's a great candidate for statewide office, a guy who can appeal beyond traditional Republican constituencies and be a conservative. Not with the Republican establishment. Because he was in trouble with the teachers' unions, the National Education Association, and some other things, because he was for school choice, big push on charter schools, the Republican establishment disdained him. And so when Christie Whitman went over to EPA, they all rallied around the new acting governor, Senate President, who, as you know, imploded. And so you'd think, well, the establishment candidate imploded, how to get out of the race, you'd think that would be open wide for Brett Schundler. No, not in New Jersey. Heck, it's like what Gore tried to do in Florida. Don't let the rules stand in the way. At least New Jersey, instead of trying to ignore them, they just changed them. The legislature recently extended the primary by a month. Said it was supposed to be in early June, now it's going to be late June. Just extend it. And extend the filing date. And then we have campaign financing in New Jersey. So since the new candidate, the establishment candidate, might not have enough money, they said, we'll give you another $1.5 million of public funding. And it's Bob Franks, very nice guy. I like Bob. He backed me in '96, didn't back me in 2000, so I have nothing against him. He almost beat Corzine. But they just parachuted him in at the last minute and changed the primary date so he'd have time to get some traction. And the other thing, I don't know if it was in the paper, I haven't read it, that's in front of you, but one of the other things they do in New Jersey, in New York, as you know, if you're not part of the establishment, they don't put you on the ballot in New York. I had a fight in '96 to do it, led the fight in 2000, which is why McCain got on the ballot there. We fought that, did the petitioning, beat them at their own game. But in New York, they're very crude, like the Soviets. They just don't let you on the ballot. New Jersey, they're a little more sophisticated, which if you watch The Sopranos, you'd realize that they do things a little differently in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, if you're not the establishment candidate, they have what they call the line. If you have the county endorsement, you're right at the top of the ballot, right across the whole establishment slate. If you're not the establishment candidate, you need a map to find the name on the ballot. It's down on the floor, under the machine. It's not readily seeable. And he's been challenging him on that. So 19 of the 21 counties in my home state have rallied around the new establishment candidate. If the primary is held today, I think Brett would win it. But what I fear is that they're going to unload some heavy artillery on him, especially with this new money that the new candidate has. And so I think we've got a real fight when the primary comes. Last I looked is the end of June. They may change it again if they think they might lose it. It's nice to be able to, gee, I'm not ahead in the polls yet, so let's change the date of the election. It's great. But Brett's a superb candidate. He'd make a superb governor. He's there to get things done, the kind of things we know that need to be done. He's in the Northeast, for goodness sakes, espousing these things. So I hope if you can see fit to help him out to do so. This is the kind of person we need more of in the Republican Party, which is, and the fact that he's being resisted should tell you there's something positive here.
Let's take one.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Do you feel the United States should withdraw from the UN?
Question is, should the U.S. withdraw from the UN? That's probably not going to be on the table. Jesse Helms and others helped conclude a deal on paying our alleged back dues. I always thought in back dues, given all the peacekeeping we did, we should have sent the bills to them for what we've done around the world. But the key is that we don't let that, as the Clinton administration is, several things we should not do. We should not allow our troops to be under UN command. They should wear the American uniform. And we should not let these agencies get their hooks into our own political system, whether it's allegedly helping the environment, whether it's allegedly helping on health. These are out of control, often corrupt, utterly inefficient bureaucracies, and we should say if that's the way they want to spend the money, fine, we're going to have nothing to do with it. So let it sit in New York, maybe charge them property taxes, and but certainly the way that agency is run, even on the one thing they could do right, are these peacekeeping missions in areas of the world where we don't have a strategic interest, or where for humanitarian purposes you don't want conflagrations. That they could do, but even there they flub it up bloodily. In 1967, before the Six-Day War, unilaterally the UN withdrew its peacekeeping troops, which guaranteed there was going to be a conflict. The reason it was done, to be blunt, was the Secretary General at the time thought that the Arabs were going to win that war. And he didn't get any criticism for it. Go fast forward. Africa, Rwanda. In early 1994, there was a peacekeeping mission there. It became clear that the new government in Rwanda was going to unleash a deadly genocide against the minority Tutsis by the Hutu majority. And how did the UN respond? How did we respond? Clinton has blood on his hands on this. Instead of increasing the peacekeeping force and bluntly telling the government, forget about trying to kill hundreds of thousands of people, they cut the force down, which was a green light for the government to go ahead. Clinton refused to intervene, even verbally, which is amazing for him. And within 4 months, 800,000 people were hacked to death before forces were put in again. Not our forces or the UN forces, it was neighboring forces that finally put a stop to it. 800,000 needlessly killed. And that's why Clinton, remember, he visited that country at the airport 3 years later and gave this half-baked apology. He knew that that could have been prevented if he'd just been willing to pick up a telephone and tell Kofi Annan at the UN, don't let this happen. So even where the UN could perform a useful service, it hasn't. So, I know we're not going to get out, but you can tell I'm not very happy about what that organization's done. I think they have real blood on their hands. Well, Morton says that I have to get down, and when you get in politics, you get that Clinton disease. You like to go on and on and on. So